Welcome back to our newest segment, Tea of the Day, where we highlight the events that happened on this day in history.
So today, January 1st, 60 years ago, Fidel Castro and his brother Raul led guerrilla forces to force Batista, the former president, out of Cuba, and Fidel declared himself prime minister with his brother as the Minister of Armed Forces.
Before we talk about what happened after this takeover, we need to understand how and why the Castros got power to overthrow the existing government.
To do that, we need to start all the way back to 1898, when the Spanish went to war with the United States over the territory of Cuba, and as a result of the Spanish defeat, the United States took possession of Cuba.
When the United States took control of Cuba, they implemented their own military as leaders of the country and passed the Platt Amendment, which stated that the United States could intervene with Cuba and they could establish a naval base there.
Not only did the U.S. set up naval bases, but they also put their own leaders as president to govern the country as the United States would.
For almost half a century, the United States put Cuba through an unstable, arrogant government which caused many people to revolt against them due to the amount of international and national rings brought to them by the United States. The Cubans were put through an economic crisis due to the United States increasing the duty of sugar, causing the market and production to plummet.
For many years, the Cubans went from president to president, making the country unstable due to the lack of dominant leaders. After many presidents put in by the U.S., Carlos Manuel de Céspedes and Quezales was the first to set aside the Constitution and bring about reforms, but these kinds of changes brought up many flags. The people of Cuba thought he was working too closely with the United States, so he didn't last long as president.
Cuba went through many presidents before Fulgencio Batista finally took power. He was president during World War II, and he entered Cuba on the side of the Allies, where he established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, for 6.5 years, Cubans from different backgrounds and political orientations revolted against the current president with violent outbursts to try to overthrow the United States' power over Cuba.
This is when it all went downhill because the Cubans were tired of Batista's rule and U.S. intervention. So Batista started to lose popularity among citizens and from the military as well. He caused sugar exports to decrease significantly, and many anti-Batista citizens organized campaigns of harassment and sabotage. One of the key anti-Batista groups was led by Fidel Castro, and this was known as the 26th of July movement, which was where Castro was getting his revolutionary fame.
During Batista's rule, there were numerous amounts of attacks against the government, including many led by Castro, but they were all unsuccessful, causing many civilians to die. By 1959, Fidel and his brother Raul led 9,000 guerrilla fighters to overthrow Batista, and for the first time they were successful. Batista was driven out of Cuba. The Castros were put as the prime minister and the prime minister of armed forces.
According to the well-known author Kaylin Sooner, Fidel Castro and the 26th of July movement, as his revolutionary initiative came to be called, used guerrilla and alliance formation to assume control of the various groups opposing Batista and to take command of the island. He promised democratic government, broad land reforms, reduction of extensive property and business holdings by foreign companies, and the redistribution of urban and rural properties owned by Cuban nationals. Such massive political and economic changes alarmed Cuban elites and the U.S. government. In the Cold War climate, Castro was perceived as a communist, not a reform nationalist, causing the United States to take immediate action against his revolutionary reorganization and island culture.
The Cubans finally got rid of the U.S. rule, but what they didn't know is how dangerous these Castro brothers really were. They were so caught up in the U.S. involvement in trying to get rid of the fascist Batista in their country that they didn't realize what the Castro brothers really were doing.
During Fidel Castro's reign, he took control of the foreign-owned businesses and he practiced communist ideals when he took control of the lands and redistributed it evenly to the peasant farmers after taking some of it from the government.
Now here's an interview with Fidel Castro himself.
So Fidel, tell me, what inspired you to start this movement against Batista?
Yeah, well, in 1952, I was going to run for the Cuban House of Representatives, but the election never happened. And I did not like the Batista in the U.S. government. So, yeah, I don't like America. Death to America.
So Fidel, what is your relationship like with the Soviet Union?
Oh my God, we're like this close to, we're real tight, real tight. Don't even get me started on Stalin. He's a great guy. Real good. Love the mustache. He's doing a pretty good job, But, and if anything happens, anybody attacks, they dead. They're gone. Blown out of water. Death to America. Yes.
So, tell me, what are the things that you've done to help the Cuban community?
Oh my goodness, it's fantastic. You should see that it's a paradise over there. It's fantastic. I abolished legal discrimination. I brought electricity to the countryside. I provided full employment. But what I did not do is I totally did not jail any of my political opponents. I'm a nice guy. I'm nice guy, right? Nice guy. Yeah. Death to America. Yes.
Well, you heard it here, folks. That is all we have for today with the one and only Fidel Castro.
Death to America.
At this point in his reign, most of the Cuban civilians supported him because he greatly improved the conditions of the peasants, which made up most of the demographic in Cuba. As a result of Castro favoring the peasants, many middle-class workers fled to Florida, leaving most of the Cuban population in favor of Castro.
During this time, the U.S. grew very cautious of Cuba as Castro started to lead Cuba in a very communist way, and they needed to act once as soon as they saw that he was in affiliation with the Soviet Union. Cuba turned to the Soviet Union after the United States had declined Castro's request for financial aid. When this happened, the U.S. declared that Castro must be overthrown before becoming too close with the Soviets.
The current U.S. President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, cut off all diplomatic ties with Cuba, leaving the U.S. isolated from the island, except for exporting food and medicine.
Since cutting off all ties with Cuba was going to completely end the communist rule, the newly inaugurated President John F. Kennedy approved the CIA's plan to invade Cuba in what is now known today as the Bay of Pigs.
Bay of Pigs.
Of Pigs video.
Castro, seeking Soviet support, finally declared that the revolution was socialist.
Porque lo que no pueden perdonarnos los imperialistas es que estemos aquí y que hayamos hecho una revolución socialista en las propias narices de los Estados Unidos.
Continuamos preparando. Resistir nada.
We prepared ourselves to resist an invasion against all the forces we knew the Americans had at their disposal.
Estados Unidos.
The following day, just 1,500 exiles, equipped with American arms and ammunition, arrived at the Bay of Pigs, 125 miles to the south of Havana. Castro's remaining air force quickly destroyed the ships carrying vital ammunition supplies. Mistakenly believing that this was a full-scale American invasion, Cuba mobilized all its forces. Without American air support or resupply, the invasion force was outnumbered and outgunned.
Jack Kennedy was devastated by the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs, and he said it was a fiasco. He was not accustomed to failure in politics or in life. And he was more distraught than I'd ever seen him. How could I have been so stupid, he said.
The Cuban Missile Crisis brings the U.S. and Cuba to the brink of nuclear war. The Soviets attempt to install medium-range missiles in Cuba, capable of striking targets in the United States with nuclear warheads. Denouncing the Soviets for deliberate deception, President Kennedy promised a U.S. blockade of Cuba to stop the missile delivery.
6 days later, Soviet Union leader Nikita Khrushchev ordered the missile sites dismantled and returned to the USSR in return for a U.S. pledge not to attack Cuba.
By 1965, Castro has renamed the only political party in Cuba to the Communist Party of Cuba, and by 76, a socialist constitution is created, and now Fidel has become the president of Cuba. However, he was not able to control the economy as it rapidly declined with the failure of communism in Europe. This ultimately led to the demise of Cuban support from Russia. While Castro made it seem as if the state of Cuba was perfectly intact, it was simply a facade.
And that's all the tea we have to spill for today, folks. Join us next time to see which country we have a fresh brew on next.